Hello everyone, my name is Holden and I am the pop culture Christian. I take a look at pop culture from a Christian perspective and find God everywhere, even in the most unlikely places. This video is somewhat of a follow-up to when my buddy Jeremy showed me the movie Heretic for the first time. If you're coming from that video, hello, how are you? If you're just stumbling upon this video by itself, that's kind of what this is. In the original video, I was gonna talk about some of these religious claims that he was making and some of his main gripes against religion as a whole. The movie itself is about these two Mormon girls, these two Mormon missionaries. So there is a level of separation. I'm not Mormon, so I'm going to try and argue both from a Mormon perspective and then just sort of a general traditional Orthodox Christian perspective, Catholic, Protestants, like the things that they typically agree on. I won't harp too much on any particular one because there was a lot that was in the movie that was brought up and that was presented. And so I could probably make an individual video based on every single one of those arguments, but I'm gonna just do it piece by piece and sort of give you the Cliff Notes version, if that's cool. One of the things that he brings up is religion as fast food. He starts bringing up about how, you like your Wendy's and your Burger King and your Taco Bell. Don't mention Taco Bell.
The last thing I wanted to do was find the Wendy's of religions. Some McNuggets here, BK Whopper over there, whatever fit the mood.
And he uses this as everybody is sort of picking and choosing what they want to be true. I am pro-truth. I want to know what is objective reality. And I think that most people would like to be that way as well. And I think that there's this underlying perspective of Christianity, of religion, from non-religious people that's just religion is not really for me, but if you need that, if that works for you, that's all good. I personally am not really interested in that perspective. I want to know, is it true? Does God exist or does he not? And I think that one of the issues that I kept running into with Hugh Grant's character is that he seems to posit these issues of exclusivity only on religion and not from a secular perspective. So example, you can criticize, look at all you religious people trying to find the truth, and you're all wrong. I am actually correct. I've learned the one true religion, and that's that no religion is true. That in and of itself is still an exclusive truth claim. Christians are wrong, Mormons are wrong, Muslims are wrong, Buddhists are wrong. They've got some good ideas, but ultimately I've figured it out. There is no God, there is no point. That's an exclusive truth claim. He also brought up another common point here is that you believe because of influence. Your parents were religious, so you become religious. You're born in the United States, so you're kind of more likely to be Christian. If I was born in India, I'd be more likely to be Hindu or something. The problem is that this is, again, not exclusive to religion. In America, there's a massive atheistic movement going on. It's typically not stigmatized like it used to be. There's also positive association with atheism that atheists are typically smarter. They're not bound by these archaic things. We figured it out. So there is a positive association with that based on influence of other atheists. I've also heard, and he didn't really touch on this, but I will bring it up, that a white man being a Christian makes the most sense, that there's sort of this racial and patriarchal incentive to be religious. But I would argue that if we're going to stay true to that, we have to acknowledge the leading demographic of atheists in this country, which are white men. But why is that exclusive only to Christians and not to atheists? Well, because you figured out the truth. You're right, and so it doesn't really matter about your race or your sex. He also makes a point, and I've heard this before too, that it's just comforting to believe in religion, whether it's true or not. So sometimes we can put away our objective sense of reality in favor of something that may not be objectively true. I just want to point out that just because something is beneficial to you as a person in nature doesn't mean it's false. I benefit from gravity. I benefit because I'm not flying off into space, right? But just because I benefit from it doesn't make it false. I also want to point out that, again, it's not exclusive to religion. There are benefits to believing in atheism, like morality being a big one. If God isn't real and there is no objective sense of morality, that opens up a lot of room for me to kind of do whatever I want. If I want to be a hedonist, if I want to sleep with as many women as possible, there's no objective moral law that says that's wrong. It really just comes down to opinion. That can be enticing. There's a portion of the movie where he starts really going into okay, now this is going to be debates. And he brings out Monopoly, he brings out various iterations of things, and he puts the Torah, the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Quran, and he basically these are kind of expounding upon themselves. I disagree with that. I don't think that they are. Also, the Torah is in the Bible. There's no changes. So those are a compendium of the same thing. I do have issue with the translation of a translation of a translation so that the original loses its meaning. I would buy that if we didn't have so much overwhelming manuscript evidence from the 1st century about Jesus specifically and the messages. So if we got rid of every Bible that exists in English and everything else, you could put back virtually 95% of the New Testament as it is written accurately based on just those manuscripts and pieces of manuscript evidence. Don't take my word for it, look it up. There's like 25,000 pieces of manuscript evidence. There's more evidence for the historicity of Jesus. I'm not arguing his divinity or if he resurrected from the dead, but just him as a historical person more than any other person in antiquity. So I've heard atheists argue that Jesus never existed. And so I really have a bone to pick with those arguments, because then we're getting into, you're not actually interested in truth, you're interested in atheistic dogma. I'm interested in truth. We can debate if Jesus was God or if that's reasonable to think, but if you're at the point where you're not even willing to concede that Jesus Christ as a person existed, then there's no point in continuing on, because that's historical fact. He also brings up that like you're salesman, and I actually agree with this to some extent, and I think that you brought up organized religion, that it does become like a sales tactic kind of thing. I have picked at that before in my life. I think it's much more genuine to form like actual relationships with people and build upon that, as opposed to, do you have a minute to talk about our Lord and Savior? I don't think that people feel the legitimacy of that, and it can come off as very salesman. Because once I've made the sale and you've converted, good luck on your faith, this was great, see ya. Versus continuing to build up that new Christian. And Paul even writes about that. But I do disagree in that he says you convince people that they'll build a better life with your religion. I won't speak on Mormonism, but I will speak on Christianity, because in Christianity, it's actually the opposite is true, that if you become a Christian, you're actually going to be faced with different persecutions and different type of struggles. And they're pretty open about that. So the idea of you getting a better life if you join Christianity is not actually a Christian teaching. And I would think that the opposite is saying, look, we want you to believe it because it's true, but keep in mind that this is kind of a countercultural thing, especially at the time with the Roman Empire and the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders at the time. It's gonna be a struggle. In the other video, I brought up the parallels between Horus and Egyptian mythology in relation to what he said. I won't rehash it all, but basically I have a bone to pick with the idea that Jesus is based on mythological figures like Horus specifically is like the number one they focus on. He did dabble into a couple others, but Horus is usually number one. That was perpetuated by a woman named Dia Murdoch. You know what's really interesting about her? She died on December 25th. That's why I think God has a sense of irony. But a lot of it was just false. It's just falsehood. 3 wise men never followed a star to find Horus. Horus is never born of a virgin. He's not a part of a trinity. He was not synchronized with God. He's not God in human form. He was never crucified. He was never resurrected. And these are all verifiable things that you can look up. Look up D.M. Murdoch. Don't take my word for it. Just look up the history of Horus. Just go straight to, okay, well, let me just read about Horus and how he was born and how he died. And that's why I was so surprised that that was actually brought up as a point in this movie, because it's so easily verifiably false. In typical contemporary culture, it's viewed that Christianity steals sort of all these ideas from pagan religions. When Halloween, Christmas, and Easter come up, you hear about it probably the most. There's a little stuff about the resurrection and like the whole prophet thing, and you know, the difference between resurrection and then resuscitation. One thing I will touch on is that Christians usually maintain that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or in Luke's case, a friend of an eyewitness, Peter. And that has gotten a lot of pushback. But one thing I find really interesting in a couple of the Gospels, I'll focus on John's Gospel, is that when John sees Jesus being crucified, after he dies, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, right? Yeah, a Roman soldier takes his spear and plunges it into his side. And John records that water and blood started pouring out. And because he's claiming, I'm seeing this happen. And the atheist perspective is that this is all a made-up story, right? And for the longest time, church fathers had no idea why that was included into his gospel. And they're like, maybe it means like the water of life is coming out, and they're trying to find all these ways. Fast forward, we find out, and I forget the term of it, but that's an actual medical condition that happens after someone has been dead for a certain period of time. This blood and water, a lot of water builds up in this area, and that Roman soldier plunged into it. I've always found that interesting that John, who's saying, I'm seeing this happen, I'm recording this seemingly innocuous detail, and then in the future we find out that there's an actual condition for it. Atheist, I don't know, guys, maybe he did. I'm not saying Jesus resurrected, but I'm just saying maybe he saw that. Prophet resurrection versus resuscitation thing was kind of weak. In the biblical sense, Jesus was dead for 3 days. He also resurrected a guy named Lazarus, who was dead also for a couple of days. So we're talking like rigor mortis set in versus in a case like this, where they did a body switch thing, but like let's say that I'm taking his word that what she's eating is actually true. It could have been a Romeo and Juliet situation where the heartbeat slows down so much it's not detectable. But I don't think that that was like in good faith. I think he was trying to show like we could fake a resurrection now if we wanted. I guess that was kind of the angle he was going for, but I didn't find that to be too compelling in comparison to the Jesus account. So this was a big one. I've heard this one before, but he touched on it briefly, and that is the reliability of memories. And he makes it a point to be like, I don't remember, you're actually recalling the last time you recalled, and so your memories can kind of get fuzzy. I took that as kind of a critique on the eyewitness testimony of sort of the gospel thing. Like, I can't remember what I ate last Tuesday. How are you telling me you can remember what Jesus said 20 years ago? And while I could see that being compelling on the surface, I think that when you go into what I would call traumatic memories, both in positive and the negative sense, I remember 9/11. I remember where I was, I remember how old I was, I remember roughly what I was doing, I remember a lot of details about it. Now, if I were to write an account about 9/11 and Jeremy were to write one based on his recollection and so and so and so and so, you would get degrees of variation from that. Maybe in 1,000, 2,000 years, people are gonna say 9/11 never happened because look at these different accounts, and somebody said there were 4 planes, somebody said there were 3, so clearly it was false. There's a book called God's Crime Scene by a guy named J. Warner Wallace. And he was an atheist police detective turned Christian, and he wrote about his issue with the Gospels in that regard specifically. He found that like if you were to take people who witness a crime, like a car hitting another car, and you were to separate the witnesses and question them, there are degrees of variation within them. And I think that it's a problem when atheists discount or minimize variations, not contradictions, but variations in the gospel, as see, clearly it's false, when we find that throughout how we conduct police work. He brought us some really interesting things, so I would definitely recommend you check him out. And then the big crescendo, the big point that he wants to make in this movie is that religion is about control. That is why it was made, that is what it is used for, and that is very clearly the crux, I think, of many atheists today. So I have a couple bones to pick with this. The first, I'm going to focus specifically on Christianity. You'd have to make the claim that Christianity, in both its origin and purpose, its intention was to control people. And I would argue that there's no evidence for that in Christianity specifically, but there's no evidence for that. What is your evidence that the origin of Christianity is about control? What is your evidence that the purpose of Christianity is about control? Because you're talking about this isolated group of people who are now going against the Jewish law and going against the Roman government, and they were actively killing these people. This is history. In the 3rd century, before Constantine legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire, the Christian population was a whopping 5%. So if we're going to argue that either the Roman Empire wanted to use Christianity to control people, or the Jewish Pharisees wanted to use religion to control people, you're going to have to convince me that the Roman Empire had no better way to control people than using a minuscule, non-related Jewish religion that most of its citizens didn't even believe in to do that. That's a tough sell. What I think is a more compelling argument is to say, look, religion has been used to control people and has been used in history for negative effects. I can agree with that, but to argue the origin and purpose of religion and Christianity in this case, that's a tough sell. I would also like to flip this on you a little bit, because if we're going to argue that religion has been used to control people, therefore it's evil, I could say, well, look at science. Science has been used for nefarious reasons to control and hurt people. I'll point to eugenics. That is an absolutely atheistic belief system built upon logic, right? If we want to get rid of Down syndrome in our genes, if we want to get rid of all these other conditions in our genes, let's just eradicate them. I mean, yeah, it feels bad to kill those people, but that's just because of our evolutionary empathy towards them. Let's get rid of that and just keep it on the facts. We're trying to make a perfect race. We're trying to make sure that none of us have any horrible conditions. That's noble. So here's a good way to do it. I mean, here's an effective way to do it. That is an atheistic proposal, eugenics is. Not, you think Christians came up with that? No. The other thing is scientific racism. Do you remember in the movie Django Unchained where Leonardo DiCaprio went through this whole thing about how a black person's brain or skull is different than a white person's brain and how they were meant to be controlled, that's their place in the universe? That's based on some real science at the time, that science was used to justify slavery in a lot of ways, that the white man was superior to the black man. I've seen people argue that Christians kind of did the same thing in the South, and they absolutely did, I'm not discounting that, but there was a precedent for atheistic science doing the same thing too. Now my conclusion isn't science is clearly evil, science is clearly wrong, but to say that science in those cases were manipulated or used for nefarious purposes, in that case of control, because the Nazis, they wanted control over that region, religion. They want to control over the Jews. But to say that it's just a uniquely religious thing, I think, or a purpose of religion, I think is a bit of a stretch in practice. And in a lot of movies like this, and kind of touching on, I think, to the very first point I made in the video, is that in movies like this, character growth is typically viewed as a relinquishing of religion and into atheism. That is character growth. I never see it really painted the other way around, and that makes sense, again, because it's Hollywood, typically not pro-religion. In The Black Phone with Ethan Hawke, there was a similar thing where the girl was praying to Jesus, and then she has this incredible moment of realization that, oh my gosh, maybe Jesus isn't real. Maybe this is all fake. And that was a moment of realization and growth for her.
I ask you for help when you give me these clues that don't mean anything. Seriously, what the hell is wrong with you?
And so that's just a gripe I have. It's more of a tropey gripe. But what do you think about some of my counterpoints, Jeremy? I know we're not getting into like a debate, but just, I don't know if you had thought about any of those or if any of those had been brought up, or if you think that they have any merit, really.
It's challenging for me, and I think there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, yeah, you made some excellent points. I think for me, in my core value system, I could never see any virtue in taking away something that's meaningful to people. And again, this is not to come off as patronizing, because I understand how it could seem like an argument of definitive truth versus something that's kind of encroaching on that or pushing back against that. There are a lot of texts to support Jesus Christ, 100%. It's almost not debatable whether or not he was real. The documentation does start to become a little more lacking when you actually do start to talk about the resurrection. I think you even touched on that as well. When I look at movies like this from a perspective of being more agnostic and accepting that there are divine truths that haven't made themselves apparent to me, I look at Hugh Grant as being an unreliable narrator at best and somebody who's incredibly deceptive at worst. Sister Paxton didn't turn away from her faith. She had a moment at the disbelief door where she kind of did turn her back on religion for the sake of what she perceived to be logic, but it was Sister Barnes that kind of course corrected her there. Maybe all of this is kind of an analogy for some people's walk with faith. I don't think that it's always a straight path forward. I think that people stumble. I think that people struggle in these existential moments where they're like, is this legit? Maybe I do need to search more for answers. And I think all of this stuff is like valid in a person's personal quest for like personhood. But when I walk away from this movie, I don't see Mr. Reed as a surrogate for the beliefs of the writers and directors. In fact, if you were to tell me like they're former Christian guys who have become more secular, that would track to me, because it just seems like a more all-accepting, all-encompassing view of the power of faith. And I think, as grotesque as it was, potentially what we see in Sister Barnes' resurrection is potentially a miracle, albeit a kind of twisted or distorted one. To me, it was more about seeing the way that Holden reacted to this movie and the feelings that he had, and every single bit of that is valid. For me, I wondered if it is my agnostic or my rejection of organized religion that ultimately made me come away thinking it was a movie that was pro-faith and pro-religion, and maybe we shouldn't be mean to Mormons or pull their underpants down in the street and shame people just for seeing things differently than we do. That has allowed me to have really meaningful relationships with Christians in my life. Some of my best friends are Christians.
Wow.
But honestly, I do not claim to know everything, and I think that allows me to be open to different people's perspectives and beliefs. I don't know a whole lot about the Horus thing. I was surprised that it never brought up Hammurabi's code and the original commandments that were found in Babylonia predating. But all of that, again, is just me musing. All I can do is take the word of these historians because I wasn't there. When it comes to iterations, you make some really compelling points. Obviously, if this is a religious minority, the aspect of control is not going to be near as effective as some other more universally accepted means. However, when we do start to get into the people, the scribes and the manuscripts, and over time and the Catholic Church and the way that people are ultimately corruptible, that leaves a little more wiggle room for me to say I don't know, maybe it's not exactly what it was. Counterpoint, you mentioned that there are original manuscripts from the first century that do still exist. So I'm open to the conversation. I say atheism more as a blanket rejection of religion than a denial of God, or certainly of a condemnation of personal beliefs. So that's kind of where I came into this movie, and that's what my perspective was. Just a flawed human being with a perspective, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
I appreciate that. I also can't help but notice that you are making a distinction when you say I have a rejection of organized religion, not necessarily a rejection of God. And I can actually really relate to that too. I don't think that there's anything wrong in pointing out the faults of organized religion. For me as a Christian, my perspective has been for at least a long time now that I don't follow other Christians. I believe Jesus is who he says he was, which is the core of my faith, with evidence to back it up, that I would at least present. You can disagree with that, my conclusion to that. But I think that it's fair to say that religion has been used to justify horrible things and has put people in power and used to control people. I think that that's fair. But I've used this Star Wars analogy before, is that I'm a huge fan of Star Wars. I love Star Wars, but man, some of the fans can really suck. Now, because the fans suck so much, does that diminish my appreciation and respect for Star Wars? No. In the same way that I can absolutely see where you're coming from because I can empathize so much, the Christians don't really, don't define my relationship with God to me. It's either true or it's not. I want to know truth, and I think that in the West, we've kind of adopted this sort of, all religions are equal, all religions are the same, which is in and of itself a truth claim. Even though the religions themselves don't agree, this outside kind of a passive, whoa man, we're all together here, is like a way to try to make it so everyone can be happy when they're all making different truth claims, including the atheist. One of my typical big gripes is like criticizing Christians, like maybe Sister Paxton, who don't actually process the implication of what they're saying to be true. I oftentimes find that a lot of atheists don't do it either. I think the sin and the transgression of the average Christian that you might find who are maybe cultural Christians, they sort of grew up and, yeah, I guess I believe Jesus rose from the dead, but never did any digging. I think that their transgression is naivety, and I think that the transgression of many atheists, I don't like to say atheist, Jeremy, I'll try to distinguish and say anti-theist versus atheist, but the transgression of them is absolutely arrogance, is like, you're dumb for thinking this, the fact that you could think that there's anything like this is stupid. I think that that's just as harmful, and it's also not scientific either. I think it's fair to say we don't know, but to say we don't know, but I definitely know it's not this thing, that's not science, that's religion. I hate to say it, but it is. Jeremy, you brought up some good counterpoints to me. Hopefully you liked some of my points, and this was a great discussion. Let us know what you think, as Jeremy and I have both said. But that's it for now. We'll catch you in the next video, everyone. Take care.